In the autumn of 1996, in a genetics lab in Toronto, a nephrologist named Karl Skorecki sat with a stack of printouts that should not have made sense. He had pulled blood samples from Jewish men who identified as Kohanim, the hereditary priestly line that Jewish tradition traces back to Aaron, the brother of Moses, more than 3,000 years ago. Some of these men were Ashkenazi, raised in Poland and Lithuania. Others were Sephardic, from Morocco and Iraq, from communities that had not exchanged a letter, a marriage, or a shared rabbi in over 1,000 years. On paper, they were strangers. Different languages, different food, different skin tones, different centuries of persecution and survival. But when Skorecki looked at their Y chromosomes, the paternal line passed unbroken from father to son. Something strange stared back at him. A huge share of these men, separated by continents and by 1,000 years of history, carried nearly the same genetic signature on that chromosome. Not a similar signature, nearly the same one. For a geneticist trained to expect noise, drift, and centuries of dilution, this was the kind of result you check twice before you believe it. He checked it. Then his team published it in Nature in 1997, and population genetics has not looked at Jewish history the same way since. That single paper cracked open a question that has occupied laboratories at Harvard, at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, at Tel Aviv University, and at the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig for almost 3 decades now. If you take the DNA of the Jewish people, one of the oldest continuously identifiable populations on the planet, and you compare it against the genetic remains of every major civilization of the ancient world, the Egyptians, the Romans, the Babylonians, the Greeks, the Persians, the Phoenicians, what comes back a match? The answer, according to a growing and increasingly rigorous body of published research, is not scattered across a dozen empires. It converges, again and again, on one narrow strip of land and one Bronze and Iron Age population. The ancient inhabitants of the Levant, the world the Hebrew Bible calls Canaan. To understand why that finding landed like a thunderclap, you have to understand what ancient DNA usually tells scientists when they go looking for continuity between an empire and its supposed modern heirs. It almost never holds up cleanly. Population geneticists have spent the last 20 years sequencing genomes pulled from tombs, battlefields, and mass graves across the ancient world, and the pattern that keeps emerging is one of dissolution. Empires that looked eternal from the inside turn out, in the genome, to be temporary. The ancient Egyptians who built the pyramids and worshipped Ra and Osiris left descendants in the Nile Valley, but the modern Egyptian population carries substantial genetic input from later migrations, including Arabian ancestry, that arrived after the 7th century Islamic conquests, and sub-Saharan ancestry absorbed over the medieval period. The line from pharaonic Egypt to modern Egypt is real, but it is heavily diluted and reshaped. The Romans, who built roads from Britain to Mesopotamia and gave the Western world its legal vocabulary, fare no better. Modern Italy has been reshaped by wave after wave of subsequent migration, and no single modern population maps cleanly onto the genetic profile of a first-century Roman aristocrat. The Greeks, the Persians, the Babylonians, the Phoenicians, all of them experienced what geneticists call admixture events large enough that their ancient genetic signal, while sometimes detectable in trace amounts, is not the dominant ancestry of any modern group who claims descent from them. Languages died. Religions transformed into something almost unrecognizable to their founders. Bloodlines dispersed into the surrounding populations until the biological thread connecting the ancient world to the modern one simply frayed apart. That is the normal fate of a civilization once you look past its myths and into its genome. And that is exactly what makes the Jewish case, according to the last decade of published research, so unusual. Start with the piece of evidence that actually started this entire field of inquiry, the Kohanim. Jewish tradition holds that the priestly caste has passed from father to son, unbroken, since the time of Aaron, roughly 3,200 years ago, through the Babylonian exile, through Roman conquest, through the total destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE, through a 2,000-year diaspora with no priesthood left to administer and no temple left to serve. No written genealogical registry survived any of that. It was oral tradition alone, carried across more centuries of upheaval than almost any surviving human institution. Skorecki's 1997 paper, followed by a more detailed 1998 study led by Michael Hammer and Mark Thomas, tested that oral claim against the biology. What they found was that a majority of men identifying as Kohanim, whether Ashkenazi or Sephardic, carried a cluster of closely related Y chromosome markers that came to be called the Cohen Modal Haplotype. Later refinements, using dozens of additional genetic markers, traced the most common of these lineages to a Near Eastern haplogroup called JP58, and dated its most recent common ancestor to somewhere between roughly 2,100 and 3,200 years ago, a window that lines up strikingly with the biblical period associated with the Davidic kingdom and the First Temple. That correspondence between genetic dating and historical timeline is not proof that Aaron existed, as described in Scripture. Genetic dating carries real uncertainty, and subsequent work by Hammer's own team in 2009 complicated the tidy version of the story, finding that the Kohanim actually carry at least 5 distinct Y chromosome lineages, meaning the priesthood was not descended from a single founder in the way the simplest reading of the legend suggests. But even with that complexity folded in, the core observation held. A hereditary religious office maintained purely through oral transmission for 3,000 years across communities that had no contact with each other showed a genetic signal consistent with a shared ancient Near Eastern paternal ancestry far beyond what chance alone would produce. That is one thread. And it is only the paternal line, a narrow slice of the full genetic picture. The real transformation came later when the technology caught up to the question. Extracting usable DNA from bones and teeth that are 2, 3, even 5,000 years old used to be nearly impossible. Ancient genetic material degrades, fragments, and gets contaminated by centuries of soil bacteria and handling. But over the course of the 2000s and 2010s, laboratory techniques advanced to the point where researchers could reliably sequence whole genomes from remains that had been in the ground since the Bronze Age. This gave rise to a new field called Archaeogenetics, and nowhere has it been applied more intensively than to the ancient Near East. In 2020, a team led by geneticist David Reich at Harvard, working with researchers from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, Tel Aviv University, and institutions in Austria and elsewhere, published a landmark study in the journal Cell. They had sequenced genome-wide data from 73 individuals recovered from 5 archaeological sites across the Bronze and Iron Age southern Levant. People who shared what archaeologists identify as Canaanite material culture, the pottery, the burial customs, the material world of the biblical era, Near East. The team modeled these ancient Canaanite populations as descending from 2 main ancestral sources: earlier Neolithic farmers who had lived in the region for thousands of years, and a wave of migrants genetically related to populations from the Chalcolithic Zagros Mountains of western Iran and the Bronze Age Caucasus. In other words, ancient Canaan was never a sealed, static population. It was already a mixture by the time the Bronze Age began, shaped by migration long before anyone wrote a word of the Bible. But the second half of that 2020 study is the part that made headlines, because the researchers didn't stop describing the ancient population. They compared it to people living today, and they found that modern populations connected to the Levant, populations across the region and its historical diaspora, typically carry substantial ancestry tracing directly back to this Bronze Age Canaanite gene pool, layered together with the genetic contributions of later migrations that arrived over the following 3,000 years. A separate but closely related study, sequencing genomes from Canaanite-era skeletons found in the ancient port city of Sidon in modern Lebanon, and comparing them against 99 present-day Lebanese individuals, reached a strikingly similar conclusion. The ancient Canaanite genetic signature had not disappeared. It persisted as the majority ancestral component in the region, continuously for roughly 4,000 years, even as later migrations layered additional ancestry on top of it. Put those two findings together, and a picture starts to emerge that most people, including most historians, were not expecting. The ancient Levant was not a civilization that vanished the way Bronze Age Egypt or classical Rome effectively vanished from the genome of their modern namesakes. It left a signal that kept showing up, generation after generation, in the populations descended from that same corridor of land. Now bring the Jewish diaspora communities back into that picture, because this is where the story gets genuinely remarkable. When researchers compare the ancient Canaanite and Iron Age Levantine genetic profile against modern Jewish populations worldwide, Ashkenazi Jews, whose ancestors settled the Rhineland around the 10th century and spread through Central and Eastern Europe, Sephardic Jews descended from communities expelled from Spain and Portugal in 1492, Mizrahi Jews who never left the Middle East at all, and Yemenite Jews who developed in near-total isolation on the Arabian Peninsula, the shared ancestral signal is not a faint trace. Multiple independent analyses have found that a majority of the genetic inheritance across these communities, in some studies estimated above 50%, traces to this same ancient Levantine ancestral core, regardless of whether the community in question spent the last 1,000 years in Germany, Morocco, Iraq, or Yemen. That is the finding that keeps forcing geneticists to reconsider what continuity even means. 2,000 years of dispersal across 4 continents, and the ancestral signal from the Iron Age Near East is still there, still measurable, still statistically undeniable. Here is where honest science has to slow down and add the complications, because the full picture is genuinely layered, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. The Ashkenazi Jewish genome in particular is not a pure, untouched transmission from antiquity. Large-scale studies, including major analyses conducted through the Hebrew University and Harvard Medical School examining medieval Ashkenazi remains from a Jewish cemetery in Erfurt, Germany, have shown that the Ashkenazi population carries a substantial share of Southern European ancestry alongside its Middle Eastern core, the genetic residue of centuries spent living, trading, and occasionally intermarrying alongside European populations, even under strict religious and social norms favoring marriage within the community. That same research has revealed that the population bottleneck long thought to define Ashkenazi genetics, the dramatic narrowing of the founding gene pool, actually happened later than scientists assumed, and that the medieval Ashkenazi community itself was more genetically diverse than its modern descendants, meaning the story of exactly how and when that founding population contracted is still being rewritten. None of this erases the ancient Levantine core. It sits alongside it, layered on top of it, the genetic evidence of a real historical journey through Europe, rather than a fictional one. So why did the ancient signal survive at all when it disappeared almost everywhere else? The answer that keeps coming up in the research is not myth, it's a demographic mechanism. Endogamy, the sustained practice of marrying within the community, maintained across most Jewish populations for the better part of 2,000 years, not as an ideology about ancestry, but as a religious and social norm. Combine that with the relatively small size of most diaspora communities, and you get what population geneticists call a strong founder effect, repeated again and again in community after community, generation after generation. Genetic diversity within these populations dropped. Specific variants, sometimes linked to disease risk, became disproportionately common, a pattern well documented in Ashkenazi populations in particular, and the ancestral signal from the Levant, instead of being slowly diluted into whichever host population surrounded a given community, was preserved with unusual fidelity. It is not that Jewish DNA is somehow immune to the normal rules of genetic mixing. It is that a specific, sustained cultural practice acted like a genetic bottleneck valve, letting outside ancestry in only slowly, while keeping the core signal intact underneath it. There is a further layer to this story that responsible researchers are careful never to skip past, because it matters enormously and because it is where genetics collides most directly with modern politics. The same body of research that traces Jewish ancestry to the Bronze and Iron Age Levant also finds that Palestinian populations carry a very substantial share of ancestry from that same ancient Levantine gene pool, in some analyses estimated even higher than the Jewish figure. This is not a contradiction in the data. It is the data doing exactly what it should do. The ancient Canaanite population was not the exclusive ancestor of any single group that exists today. It was a real, historically documented population living in a region that multiple modern peoples now trace descent from through different historical paths, different religious and linguistic transformations, and different centuries of subsequent migration. Genetics can measure ancestry, it cannot adjudicate sovereignty, and no credible geneticist working in this field claims that it can. What the ancient DNA record actually shows is that the Levant, from the earliest periods of settled civilization, was a genuinely dynamic crossroads. Populations moved through it constantly. The Bronze Age individuals excavated from sites like Megiddo were themselves already a genetic blend of local Neolithic farmers and migrants from the Zagros Mountains and the Caucasus, and a small cluster of outliers found at Megiddo carry unusually high Caucasus-related ancestry, suggesting fresh migration pulses were still arriving in the region deep into the second millennium BCE, centuries before anything resembling the biblical narrative of ancient Israel takes shape. There was no ethnically sealed, unchanging population sitting still in that land for 4,000 years, waiting to be claimed by one group or another. There was continuous movement, continuous mixture, and multiple modern populations, who can all, honestly and simultaneously, trace real ancestry back to it. What makes the Jewish case scientifically unusual, then, is not purity, because no human population on Earth has genetic purity in any meaningful sense, and claiming otherwise misunderstands what these studies actually show. What makes it unusual is persistence across an extraordinary combination of distance and time. A population dispersed across virtually every continent on Earth, subjected to expulsions, pogroms, and genocide, operating for 2,000 years without the shared territory, shared government, or shared everyday language that normally hold a population's genetic continuity together, nonetheless retained a detectable, statistically robust genetic connection to a very specific corner of the ancient Near East. Compare that again to the fate of the Roman aristocracy, or the population of pharaonic Thebes or classical Athens, groups that never left their homeland at all and still saw their genetic signal diluted past the point of clean recovery within a few centuries of migration and conquest. The Jewish diaspora did the opposite. It scattered across the globe and the genetic thread held anyway. It's worth pausing on the Phoenicians specifically, because they sat almost next door to ancient Canaan, spoke a closely related Semitic language, and built one of the greatest maritime trading networks the ancient world ever saw, stretching from modern Lebanon all the way to Carthage on the coast of North Africa. If any ancient civilization should have left an obvious unbroken genetic footprint, it should have been a seafaring empire that planted colonies across the entire Mediterranean basin. And yet, when researchers sequence the remains of ancient Phoenician colonists and compare them against the populations of the cities they founded, the male lineage tells one story and the rest of the genome tells another. Studies of Phoenician-era burials in places like Sardinia and North Africa show that many colonial settlements carried surprisingly little Phoenician ancestry beyond the paternal line, meaning Phoenician men frequently intermarried with local women almost as soon as they landed, and within a handful of generations, the broader genetic signature of the colony had been absorbed into the surrounding population. An empire of trade routes and shared language turned out to be, biologically speaking, remarkably shallow. It spread its culture far more successfully than it spread its genome. That contrast matters because it shows the disappearance of an ancient population's genetic signal isn't about how powerful or widespread a civilization was. The Phoenicians were arguably more successful expansionists than almost anyone else in the ancient Mediterranean, and their DNA still dissolved within a few centuries of contact. Whatever mechanism preserved the Levantine signal in Jewish communities for 2,000 years, it clearly was not simply a matter of coming from a resilient or dominant ancient culture. Something else, some specific combination of religious practice and community structure, had to be doing the work. There's also a mitochondrial DNA dimension to this story that adds real precision to the maternal side of the picture, complementing what the Y chromosome data showed about paternal descent. For years, researchers debated whether the founding maternal lineages of Ashkenazi Jewish communities were primarily Levantine in origin or primarily drawn from local European women who joined Jewish communities through conversion or intermarriage in medieval Europe, a genuinely contested question in the field. More recent analyses, using improved methods for distinguishing founding lineages from lineages absorbed later into the population, have found that only a small minority, well under a fifth of individuals sampled, carry maternal lineages traceable to later European absorption, while the majority trace back to a limited set of founding maternal lines whose deeper origins point toward the Near East rather than Europe. Put the paternal and maternal evidence together, layer in the autosomal data from the full genome, and you get 3 separate lines of genetic inquiry, using different methods, different research teams, and different decades of technology, converging on the same broad conclusion. The ancestral core of Jewish communities worldwide traces back to the ancient Levant with a consistency that is, in the language the researchers themselves use, statistically remarkable. None of this means the science has settled every question, and it would be a mistake to present it that way. Genetic dating always carries a margin of error. Ancient DNA samples, however carefully excavated, represent a limited number of individuals standing in for populations of many thousands. And every finding in this field gets revised as new remains are excavated and new sequencing methods improve resolution. The 2020 cell study on the Bronze Age Levant itself acknowledged that a meaningful share of the ancestry in modern Levant-related populations comes from sources the researchers could not fully model with the ancient samples available to them, meaning later migrations after the Bronze Age, migrations the current data can only partially account for, still shape the modern picture in ways future research will need to clarify. Scientists are not claiming to have found biological proof of any specific religious narrative. What they are reporting, carefully and repeatedly in peer-reviewed language, is that the genetic evidence is concordant with the historical account of Jewish origins in the ancient Near East, meaning it fits, meaning it lines up, without constituting independent proof of every detail in that account. And yet, step back from the technical caveats for a moment and consider what has actually been demonstrated here, because it really is remarkable on its own terms. A population was expelled from its ancestral homeland in the 1st century, scattered across Europe, North Africa, the Middle East, and eventually the entire globe. It endured medieval expulsions from England, from France, from Spain in 1492, from Portugal 5 years later. It endured the ghettos of Venice and Frankfurt, the pogroms of the Russian Empire, and in the 20th century a genocide that eliminated roughly 6 million people and came close to erasing entire regional communities outright. Through every one of those catastrophes, in isolated pockets on nearly every inhabited continent, the practice of marrying within the community persisted, imperfectly, unevenly, but persistently enough that when geneticists in the 21st century finally had the tools to check, the biological signature of a Bronze and Iron Age Levantine population was still there to be found, in a molecular record that nobody alive was consciously trying to preserve. Nobody in Yemen and nobody in Poland was sequencing genomes and coordinating a 2,000-year experiment in ancestral preservation. It happened as a byproduct of religious practice and social structure, sustained separately by isolated communities that, in most cases, had no contact with each other for centuries, and it still converges on the same origin point when the DNA finally gets read. It also helps to look at how differently this pattern shows up across the various Jewish diaspora communities individually, because the uniformity of the underlying signal is easy to state in the abstract, and much more striking once you see the specific communities involved. Yemenite Jews, for instance, developed for centuries in near-total geographic isolation on the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula, cut off from other Jewish communities by hundreds of miles of desert, and yet genetic studies consistently place them among the communities most closely clustered with the ancient Levantine ancestral signal, with comparatively little of the surrounding admixture found elsewhere. Mizrahi communities across Iraq, Iran, and Syria, populations that in many cases trace their presence in the region back to the Babylonian exile itself in the 6th century BCE, show a similar pattern, a strong Middle Eastern ancestral core with more modest and more locally specific admixture layered on top, depending on the host population. Sephardic communities, descended from Jews expelled from the Iberian Peninsula in 1492 and 1497, and later dispersed across North Africa, the Balkans, and the Ottoman Empire, show yet another distinct admixture profile, shaped by centuries in Spain before the expulsion, and yet the underlying ancestral core still points back to the same geographic origin as every other Jewish community studied. 4 populations, separated from each other by deserts, oceans, empires, and centuries, each with its own distinct history of local intermarriage and cultural development, and each one still resolving, when the genome is finally sequenced, to the same ancient starting point. That is not what population genetics normally predicts for groups with that little sustained contact with one another. It is, by any reasonable statistical standard, exactly what you would expect if the traditional account of a single ancient population that dispersed outward from a shared homeland roughly 2,000 years ago were actually true. What does a finding like that actually mean, beyond the laboratory? Scientists are careful, and rightly so, not to answer that question themselves, because it isn't a scientific question anymore once you ask it. DNA cannot tell you what identity means. It cannot settle a political dispute. And every serious researcher in this field says so explicitly when their work gets pulled into arguments, it was never designed to resolve. What the data can do, and what it has done with increasing precision across 3 decades of published, peer-reviewed research, is confirm that a specific historical claim, that a widely dispersed people maintained a real, traceable connection to a specific ancient population in a specific ancient land, is not simply a story people tell about themselves. It is a pattern that shows up independently in Y chromosome studies, in mitochondrial studies, and in whole genome comparisons against actual excavated Bronze and Iron Age skeletons conducted by research teams on different continents who were not working together and were not trying to reach a predetermined conclusion. Most ancient civilizations, once you go looking in their descendants' genomes, turn out to be more myth than molecule, absorbed, diluted, and dissolved into the populations that came after them. The Bronze and Iron Age Levant is the rare case where the myth and the molecule still largely agree. The research is ongoing. New excavations are producing new remains every year, and each new genome adds detail, occasionally overturning assumptions that seemed settled a decade earlier. But the core finding, replicated across independent studies and independent methods for almost 30 years now, has not moved. When scientists lined up the DNA of the Jewish people against every major civilization of the ancient world, only one population kept coming back as a genuine, statistically significant match, and it was the one their own tradition had been naming all along.